Howdy folks, and welcome back to World of Warships with Rear Admiral Jingles, and technically the star of today's show, because he submitted the replay, is Death Warmed Up here in the American Tier 6 premium battleship, the USS Arizona. Although I say technically because there's certainly a fairly strong case that could be made to say that the star of today's show is in fact the aircraft carrier on the enemy team, and you'll see why I say that towards the end of this particular battle. For now, however, let's just talk a little bit about the USS Arizona that Death Warmed Over is playing. Premium Tier 6 US Navy battleship. The Arizona, of course, was sunk during the 1941 sneak attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor, and remains there to this day as a memorial. The Arizona was the second ship in the Pennsylvania class of US Navy battleships. These were First World War vintage designs, built between 1912 and 1916, and succeeded by the New Mexico class of battleships built between 1916 and 1919. Now, the New Mexico exists in World of Warships as the non-premium Tier 6 US Navy battleship, and comparisons are often drawn between the two. Even though the New Mexico was the class of battleships that succeeded the Pennsylvanias, of which the Arizona was the second, they are very similar in design. They both share an absolutely terrible top speed of 21 knots. They're both armed with 12 14-inch guns, although this is where there start to be some differences. However, while both classes of ships sport the same number and caliber of main battery guns, they're not the same guns. The New Mexico's guns are 5 calibers longer in barrel length, which results in increased velocity and therefore increased penetration at long range. By comparison, the Arizona, when firing at heavily armoured targets at long range, might be better off switching to high explosive ammunition. Of course, if you're firing at Tier 5 cruisers, the armour piercing definitely gets the job done. That was a fairly interesting opening salvo. The flip side is that the Arizona's guns are more accurate than the guns on the New Mexico, with a better Sigma rating that allows you to pull off shots like that every now and then at maximum effective range. The Arizona also has better armour, but is more sluggish, with a slower rudder shift time, and both ships share the same absolutely terrible top speed of 21 knots. Perhaps the most significant difference between the two ships, however, is in their anti-aircraft firepower. The New Mexico survived Pearl Harbor, the Arizona did not. And that Kirov doesn't look like he's going to survive. Ooh, ow, ow. Well, there's first blood and a 20-kilometre killing Citadel hit against that very, very unfortunate Kirov. But yes, anti-aircraft guns. As I said, the New Mexico survived Pearl Harbor, Arizona didn't. And so the Arizona that we see in the game features the original post-World War II anti-aircraft configuration, or, in other words, absolutely terrible anti-aircraft firepower. The New Mexico, however, did survive Pearl Harbor, went on to be refitted. Most of her secondaries were stripped out and fitted with lots and lots and lots of anti-aircraft guns. So when it comes to getting attacked by aircraft, it's far better to be in a New Mexico than an Arizona. However, it's not strictly that bad in this particular battle for Death Warmed Over, because he is top tier. The enemy aircraft carrier is a Ryujo, and while it's not going to be pleasant getting attacked by an aircraft carrier in an Arizona of any tier, at least it could be a hell of a lot worse. The Arizona definitely does not enjoy being bottom tier and coming under attack from Shokakus, Saipans, Enterprises, and Lexingtons. But that's at least not something that Death Warmed Over is going to have to worry about in this particular battle. The Ryujo is as bad as it's ever going to get. Hang on a minute. There's a Colorado up there to the north on the enemy team. The presence of the Colorado would indicate that perhaps Death Warmed Over isn't quite as top tier as I might have initially imagined. Really, Jingles, you've just noticed it's actually a Tier 7 battle? Yes, I kind of have. Hey, look on the bright side, at least I caught the mistake this time. I know, it's not much of a consolation, but I'll take it. Anyway, yeah, that is a lot of enemy battleships over to the east, with a substantial amount of cruiser support as well. Colorado, New Mexico, October Revolution, there's a Bedioni up there, there's a Shaw's up there. And judging by the torpedoes that just sailed through one of the gaps up there, presumably targeting the friendly Nicholas, that's also the location of, in fact, yes, he was spotted over there, the enemy Shiratsu. So nobody is in any particular rush to push over to the eastern side of the map at the moment. The same cannot be said of the friendly Scharnhorst up to the north. There he is, 10 kilometers away from any kind of support and getting torpedoed by the Janwei. So there's some deep water torpedoes. He is flooding, so his damage control's on cooldown, presumably as a result of extinguishing the fires set by the Dallas, shelling him with 152mm high explosive from the north. He's also coming under rocket plane attack. He's attempting to counteract the damage over time with his heel, but rushing that far ahead of the rest of the team as early in the match as this means that he is the first casualty of Death Warmed Over's team. Now, the enemy Colorado over to the east certainly hasn't overextended the same way that the Scharnhorst just did, but he is getting focused down pretty heavily by Death Warmed Over's team. And that's good, of course. He's also a top-tier battleship, and removing him from play is a priority. The Colorados were even slower than the New Mexicos and the Pennsylvanias, like the Arizona here. But even though the last of the Colorados was built in 1923, they would remain the most powerful battleships in the US Navy's inventory until the introduction of the North Carolina class of battleships, which were commissioned in 1941. This, of course, was a direct result of the limitations imposed by the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. The US Navy did intend to build and started the design of yet another class of battleships, the South Dakotas, which, if not for the limitations of the Washington Naval Treaty, if they had been built, none of them were, would have been the biggest, most heavily armoured, and most powerful battleships anywhere in the world at the time. The US Navy actually began construction of 6 of these monsters between 1920 and 1921, although the following year the Washington Naval Treaty happened, and so construction on all 6 was suspended, and the Navy had to make do with its Colorados, New Mexicos, Pennsylvanias, and Tennessees. And that's one particular Colorado who doesn't seem to have had the sense to stop shooting his guns, to at least attempt to go undetected, the second he started getting focused down, and he's almost certainly about to pay the price for that error of judgment. Yep, there he goes. The third victim of today's battle, and it's interesting to note that 2 of the first 3 victims were both top-tier battleships. Well, getting back to the subject of the South Dakotas, the US Navy did begin construction of all 6 of these battleships, although all 6 were cancelled on the 17th of August 1922. The existing guns were transferred to the US Army and used as coastal defence batteries. The ship's boilers were transferred to the Florida, Wyoming and New York classes in the middle of the 1920s, and the armour plates were used to reinforce the existing armour of other battleships. And while none of the ships were completed, you may recognise some of the names which were reused later on down the line. Aside from the South Dakota and the Indiana, which were the 2 first ships to begin construction, the remaining 4 ships were named the Montana, the North Carolina, the Iowa, and the Massachusetts, names which should be very familiar to players of World of Warships. And before everybody goes crazy in the comments saying, oh my god, Jingles has lost it again, I'm not saying that the Montana, the Massachusetts, the Iowa, and the North Carolina were South Dakota class battleships. I'm just saying that the names were reused in upcoming new battleship designs in the mid and late 1930s and at the outbreak of World War II. Well, anyway, back to the battle. This was actually quite an unusual game for World of Warships. Aside from the early casualties, both teams settled down and started to play it pretty cautiously by most standards. By the time more than half of the match had elapsed, both teams still had more than half of their ships. But the next focus fire target is going to be this Dunkirk over here, who's about to make a little bit of a miscalculation. Death Warmed Over has some shots in the air. He's on 35,000 damage. The Dunkirk's hit for around about 7,000. He's also being focused down by the friendly Shawls, just over there on the other side of the island. And the Shawls is another one of those ships, like the Arizona, that tends to work best while engaging targets at long range. Now, admittedly, the error that the Dunkirk is about to commit was compounded by the fact that he was under torpedo attack from the friendly Furious's torpedo bombers. He's about to turn in towards the incoming attack. And that's what's going to seal his fate. Note the smoke screen up ahead, deployed by the enemy Shiratsu. If the Dunkirk, who has been hit again and has taken a couple of torpedoes, had turned to port, instead of turning to starboard, he may have been able to go undetected behind that smoke screen and use it to duck into cover behind one of the islands, but instead he turns the other way, which means he can't hide behind the smoke screen, and the only island that is nearby is actually preventing him from manoeuvring out of the way of this salvo from the Arizona, which is about to catch him square in the broadside and sink him. A couple of seconds later, Death Warmed Over is still hard detected, yet without a single enemy ship in direct line of sight. And he correctly guesses that that means the Shiratsu is somewhere nearby and is almost certainly closing in for the kill. The Atlanta behind the island, taking advantage of the destroyer's spotting, is proving to be a bit of a pain in the arse, but there's nothing that Death Warmed Over can really do about the Atlanta for now. It's the Shiratsu over there who's the more immediate source of his problems. If he can kill that destroyer, and he very nearly did, the Atlanta isn't going to be able to take advantage of his spotting, and is either going to have to come out and fight on his own terms, or if he has any sense, run away and find another island to hide behind a little further away and hope that somebody else takes over the destroyer's spotting duties. And that somebody may end up being the enemy Ryujo. We haven't seen much of him so far. He's been mostly occupied with ships further to the north, but he's starting to send his aircraft down to the south. Oh, the Shiratsu just popped up and then just as quickly disappeared again. He's firing from within the smokescreen. Although, judging by the colour of those shell tracer, I think he suffered from a little bit of a rush of shit to the brain, because that was destroyer caliber armour piercing. Okay, he switched to the high explosive. That makes a lot more sense. There are almost certainly torpedoes on the way, which is why Death Warmed Over is approaching the smokescreen nose first. But Death Warmed Over has also taken this opportunity to switch to high explosive ammunition, and one of those shells scored a hit. Now, the Shiratsu was already on very low health after the first armour-piercing salvo, took about half of his remaining health off. There are the torpedoes, exactly as anticipated. That Shiratsu is not going to stay hidden inside that smokescreen forever. That's 6 guns loaded with 14-inch high explosive. There he is. Who's going to get him? It's Death Warmed Over. Now, you may have heard the anti-aircraft guns going off there. Death Warmed Over wasn't coming under attack. The enemy Ryujo was actually sending his rocket attack planes to strike the Königsberg down to the south. What was amusing was that he had to fly through the anti-aircraft bubbles of an Arizona, okay, no big deal, but also a Shaw's in order to get there, so he's almost certainly lost a couple of aircraft. Meanwhile, there's the Atlanta, who, I have to say, has probably left it just a little bit too late to bug out. Death Warmed Over is reloading the armour-piercing, and the Atlanta is going to have to make a turn to either port or starboard, probably port, in order to get out of here, and the second he does that, he's going to get hurt real bad. He was lucky to survive. But a couple of things are going to happen in the next minute that bear closer examination. First, the Ryujo is finally taking an interest in Death Warmed Over and is sending torpedo bombers over to strike him now that he's on low health. Secondly, the Atlanta, making a sudden turn to broadside when there's an Arizona loaded with armour piercing less than 10 kilometres to your rear, didn't work out too well for him the first time, and it's not going to work out too well for him this time either. The Atlanta is down, but here come the torpedoes. Hang on a second. Were those even aimed? Those were either dropped too soon or not fully aimed, or possibly both. Surely it was a fluke. Here they come again from the other side. One of those actually hit. But the thing about torpedoes is they have a minimum arming distance. They have to run a certain distance before the fuses activate. Oh well, never mind, here we go, third time lucky. And... oh, he's dropped those awfully close. I'm beginning to see a pattern emerging here. I'm not sure I get why it's happening. I mean, that's not the first carrier this guy has ever played. Unless he free XP'd his way to tier 6, which, let's face it, is a possibility. Still, he's not that far away, He's barely 10 kilometres away, hiding behind an island. He has been detected, which means that he should be able to recycle his torpedo bomber squadrons pretty quickly, even if he's lost a few and he's prepared to put a less than full squadron into the air. Oh, this has got to be another kill. It is. That's the Kraken unleashed. But oh, hang on a second. Is that the sound of aircraft engines I can hear overhead? I do believe it is. He's coming back for more. He can't possibly miss. Look at the speed the Arizona is doing. Now, these mid-tier American battleships are not the longest targets in the game, but they're still pretty damn big, and at that kind of speed, not even 10 knots, it's hard to see how the Ryujo could miss. Well, he didn't miss. But once again, he dropped them far too late. Well, let's see if we can make it 5th time lucky. Once again from the other side, and wait for it. There, oh dear. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, 5 torpedo drops, 6 torpedo hits, and the grand total of 0 damage. Now, just for the benefit of those of you who perhaps haven't played aircraft carriers since the CV rework and therefore have absolutely no idea just how difficult it is to fuck that up, let me show you how it should be done. So, I set up a training room with my Ryujo against the New Mexico, which technically should be harder because the New Mexico actually has anti-aircraft guns. Now pay attention to the UI elements here. In particular, pay attention to the torpedo aiming indicator, which shows you just how wide the torpedoes are going to go if you don't bother to wait and actually aim them. And it's going to pop up right as I begin the attack run, now. You see how wide that spread is? Does that remind you of anything? Lesson number 1. Wait for your aiming reticle to turn at least some kind of shade of green. That way there's a better than average chance that the torpedoes may actually go in the direction that you want them to. Lesson number 2. Try to make sure that the target is also in the green bit of the aiming reticle. That way the torpedoes will have time to arm before they hit the target. And you really do want the torpedoes to arm before they hit the target, because then Mr. Torpedo does the explodey thing that makes him so much fun to have around at parties. I am genuinely mystified as to how people could possibly get it this badly wrong. I mean, don't forget, one of the whole points of the aircraft carrier rework was to make carrier gameplay simpler. Of course, you realise that as soon as Wargaming see this video, tomorrow there'll be an emergency meeting in St. Petersburg. Holy shit, some of the players are so incredibly dumb that they haven't even been able to manage the basics of easy mode carrier gameplay. Quick, buff carriers to compensate. So, I don't know. Perhaps I should unlist this video just to be on the safe side. Still, I'm betting that Death Warmed Over isn't complaining, because if it hadn't been for the gross incompetence of that Ryujo player, Death Warmed Over wouldn't have been Death Warmed Over, he'd have just been death. And this battle might have gone the other way. Fortunately for us, it didn't. The timer ran out, his team were just ahead on points, and that was a win. That's it for today. Hope you all enjoyed it, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.